Devin Townsend podcast is presented yet again by Inside Out Music, and this month's featured release is by a band called O. Their new album is called Frailty 2. Stay tuned at the end of the interview, and we will be talking to Anthony from the band, and he'll tell you why you should care.
Yo, it's Dev. Thanks for tuning in. This month, my guest is Blindboy Boatclub, legal name. I'm fortunate to know a lot of brilliant artists, but this guy's one of my favorite by a large margin. I think he's fearless and empathetic and a really fascinating person, and I'm very fortunate to have him in my life to some degree. So if you don't know of him, my hope is that after this you will be significantly interested in seeking out all the TV shows that he's done, read the books that he's done, pay attention to his podcast or his band, the Rubberbandits. I love this guy, and so check it out, Blindboy.
So there you go, now we're recording.
That's amazing, actually.
Yeah.
So this is Zencastr, and it's a whole new thing, and it's crazy that all these technologies exist that you don't take into consideration there may be a solution for. You were talking about Adobe AI as well.
Well, what we were speaking about, Devin, is so me and you, the last time we met in person, you appeared at my podcast in Vancouver, and we had an amazing night. It was incredible. It was a wonderful audience, and the venue was fantastic too. But when I got the recording of our podcast, we were both speaking into SM58 live mics, which is good, but it's not studio quality. So you were the first person I'd spoken to recently who was like a North American male. So what I did was I ran your voice through AI, because the thing is AI doesn't really, if I tried to put my voice into AI to upscale it, it doesn't understand the dude from Limerick. It turns me into Mr. Lucky Charms, to be honest. But because you've got a Canadian accent, it turned your voice, it took poor quality live audio and made it sound like it was in a studio. But what I find amazing is when people listen to the podcasts between me and you, technically you didn't really appear on the podcast. What appeared was an artificial intelligence clone of your voice, which I just that it's very Blade Runner.
Does he have more hair?
How do you feel about AI?
I think I am in the minority with the friends of mine in that I see it as a tool that can really help my process in a lot of ways. And I also feel that it's inevitable. So to not try to find some sort of internal peace with it, and then in a best case scenario, have it augment what I'm doing, just seems like you're fighting against a unstoppable tide.
Mm-hmm. I'm like, I use it, but I try to use it ethically.
How would you define ethically in that sense?
It's a tough one, you see, because right now it doesn't threaten what I do, and it doesn't threaten what you do. There are certain artists, illustrators, people who are illustrators, their jobs are threatened by AI. Graphic designers, their jobs are threatened by AI. Like, AI is never going to write a short story or write a song like me. AI is never going to do what you do. It can approximate it, you know. I use AI as a tool also. Like, for instance, I wrote a book of short stories. I published it there about a month ago. And the book took me about 2 years to write. And I used AI as a tool while I was writing that book, what I was doing was I'd write a first draft of a short story, and then I would put that first draft into artificial intelligence, and I would say to artificial intelligence, give me a feminist analysis of this story. Give me a Jungian analysis of this story. Analyze this story using the hero's journey. And the AI would feed me back these analysis of my story from all these different perspectives. And it wasn't creating anything for me, but it was like a feedback. It was feedback. It's like, oh, wow, that's something I didn't think about. Or if I gave it a story that I was writing and it fed it back to me with the hero's journey being, you know about the hero's journey. I think we spoke about it the last time, didn't we?
Mm-hmm.
It's, for anyone who doesn't know, there was a dude called Joseph Campbell, and I think he was a comparative mythologist. And what Joseph Campbell did is that he looked at all the mythology and folklore across cultures in the world, and he found that all human stories do have a very common structure. And he called this structure the hero's journey. And if you're writing, Jesus, anything, a story, a show, having the hero's journey by your side as something to kind of a piece of feedback can be very helpful. I use I don't follow the hero's journey, right? When I'm writing anything, I never follow the hero's journey. But when I have a first draft, I'll always compare it to the hero's journey because it'll let me know if a hole may be missing. Do you get me?
I do.
The last time we spoke backstage, we didn't speak about it on stage, but you were using the hero's journey, weren't you?
Yeah, and I found that the tropes of it became, at first it was really rewarding because as someone who doesn't write, which was part of what I was going to ask you today as well, it was an efficient way for me to find a narrative that flowed in a reasonably accessible way. But the more that I started trying to integrate it into my work, and this is potentially because I'm not a writer, I found that the tropes were just very I couldn't avoid certain things, and finding a different I don't know what would be the term for the type of story arc, because there's got to be more, of course, than the hero's journey, but I found for myself in the narrative that we're trying to write for this musical that the hero's journey as a framework was very efficient in a similar way to, as you're describing, AI gives you a different vantage point. But it kind of stalled for me, and I think a lot of that just has to do with the fact that I'm not I'm not a fantastic writer.
I find with the hero's journey is we, as audiences, we expect it now without us even knowing. You know, we expect. Sometimes if you go and see a movie, for instance, and you know that movie was 90 minutes long, but the experience of seeing the film felt a little bit too long.
Mm-hmm.
That often means that some point of the hero's journey wasn't hit appropriately.
Oh, that's interesting.
And we don't know this, like we don't consciously aware, but it's like, why did that film drag on? And it's because we didn't hit those points. Like, for anyone who doesn't know, I mean, it starts off with a hero. A hero can be anything. A hero can be an idea. And then this hero is called to adventure in some way. I mean, Lord of the Rings is the classic example. Starts off with Frodo. I've only seen Lord of the Rings once now, but he starts off in Frodo and he lives in that land that looks like a golf course. And then he's called to adventure. And then what happens is he reaches a threshold, the fish is taken out of water, and all of a sudden you're in a completely new landscape, which is very different to how you started. And then they face a bunch of challenges. You get to the middle part where the hero has a revelation of some description. And then once you get to the middle, it's a rebirth until you arrive back to the start. And this is what Joseph Campbell, he saw this in all mythology around the world. I've thought about it a lot in terms of psychology. Like, if you think about the human life, you're born, then you're a kid, you're finding things out, you have the safety of childhood. Then you get to about 20 and you're thrust into adulthood. And when you're thrust into adulthood, you're the fish out of water, you're on your own. But then you reach the midpoint of your life. And usually at the midpoint of your life, you have kids. And when you have kids, you as an adult are effectively watching them go through that same journey. And then you arrive back at the start. So it's the having kids and raising them. That's the second part of the hero's journey. And then you kind of start off born, unable to move and shitting yourself. And if you're lucky, that's how you're going to die too. Unable to move in a bed, shitting yourself, surrounded by loved ones. I mean, that's how we want to die. You're born.
It just sounds like a Friday.
But that's what we all want. We all want to be babies.
I'm great, man. Then I'm doing well. Then I had first heard of the hero's journey through the George Lucas, how he had used it as the primary foundation for Star Wars, and how effectively that resonated was shocking, actually.
Yes, Star Wars is a classic example of it. I mean, if you were saying there, also you're using different techniques to try and write things. There's a bunch of techniques you can use for writing. The simplest one I'd ever tell anyone is it's one called a Chekhov's gun. If you're writing a story and you don't know how this thing is going to end, you do what's called planting a gun. There was a playwright called Anton Chekhov. I think he was Russian or Czechoslovakian, I'm not sure. But what Chekhov kind of did with his plays is he said, if you open a play or a story and there's a gun, then that gun needs to shoot someone at the end of the story. And all you're speaking about there is an object. It's kind of, I don't want to say it's lazy. It's not lazy. It's just like
convenient.
It's convenient. If you're writing a musical, then you want to pick one melody, and this melody comes back throughout the musical. You want a melody at the start, and then if you play with that one melody throughout the musical, that's a Chekhov's gun. A really good Chekhov's gun is in fucking Pulp Fiction, the briefcase. And the beauty of the briefcase in Pulp Fiction is because Tarantino is a postmodernist, he knows that's Chekhov's gun. Like, we spend all our time wondering, what's in that fucking briefcase? What is it? Is it the soul of Marcellus Wallace? Is it money? Is it gold? And really, it's nothing. It's a plot point. It's a plot point. It's a plot point in a movie. If you take the briefcase out of Pulp Fiction, then everything falls apart. All it is an object of desire that makes all the other stories connect. And that's why it was so clever when Tarantino did that, But if you're ever writing a story and you're like, I don't know, is this finished? Go back to the start. Find anything, a fucking dog, a little, like even in a film like Schindler's List, that girl with the red coat in Schindler's, like the whole film is black and white, and then you've got one girl in the red coat, like that right there, like that is an astounding example of that. But you can do that with any story. You see a dog at the start of the story. How does this end? Well, maybe the dog gets hit by a car at the end. And really it is kind of lazy, but what you're giving people, and this is what's important, you need to give people a feeling of completion, a feeling of satiation. I mean, storytelling. You go to dinner, you have dessert, you have a starter, you have a main course, and you have a dessert. And once those 3 points are hit, you leave with a feeling of satiation. The simplest structure of any story is set up, conflict, resolution. Those 3 things. You have set up, conflict, resolution. You've got a 3-act structure. And it doesn't... like even my live podcast, Devin, that me and you did. I start off the live podcast with just me on stage, and I speak to the audience and I read a story. Then I brought you out as my guest. Me and you spoke for like an hour. And then at the end, I asked the audience questions. And that's a little 3-act structure. And people don't know that it is. But really what I'm doing is I want people to leave with a feeling of, I had a little journey there. Set up, conflict, resolution. I feel satiated. I feel like I've been fed. I'm talking too much. I need to point out to everybody that I'm autistic. So I have a tendency to take over conversations. Sorry.
I love it. I love it, man. If there's anybody in my creative world that I would love to have take over, it's you 100%, my
Thank
friend,
you.
brother. But everything that you've said leads into a thought that I've just been dying to ask you, and to get your thoughts on. So, what's the foundation of art for the species? Like, how do you think it started, and what do you think its role is in humanity?
That's a toughie. Um, I've been thinking a lot about Greek mythology recently. Um, there's a beautiful story in Greek mythology. This is about 2,500 years old, and it's the story of Zeus and Prometheus. And this is what I adore about Greek mythology as almost a religious belief. So Zeus and Prometheus are Zeus is a god and Prometheus is a titan. So it's not a god, but he's almost a god. So Zeus and Prometheus are really fucking bored, and they're like, "Our lives are perfect up here on Mount Olympus. That this is amazing, but we're really bored. We have everything." So then Prometheus says, "Why don't we make like a video game type thing? Why don't we make like a little world of people, and we just control it and have fun with it?" And what they were discussing there was whether or not to make humans. And Prometheus was all for the idea. Let's do it. But then Zeus was like, I kind of like the idea and I can see how it could be fun. But what if the fucking humans become smarter than us? What if the humans that we make, because we're going to model them on ourselves, what if this game that we make, what if they try to destroy us? And then Prometheus said, look, we'll figure something out. And Zeus had an idea. Okay, let's make this world, this human world, our plaything, but they're effectively Neanderthals. They're cavemen, okay? So Prometheus agrees and they make humans. So they're playing with their human world like it's a video game. But all the humans they're really cold. They're hunting animals. They're not really doing much. But Zeus enjoys it because he likes the power, but Prometheus starts to love the humans and starts to I feel kind of sorry for these humans that they don't live as good as us. So Prometheus steals fire from Zeus and gives it to the fucking humans. And as soon as the humans get fire, because you see they're living in two different planes of time as well. So time to Zeus is 1 week, but in the human world, it could be 100,000 years. You know what I mean? Like you're playing a video game. So Prometheus gives fire to the humans, and all of a sudden now, the humans start to get really, really smart, and they start to create art. They start to create sculptures and paintings. And then Zeus gets really frightened, because to Zeus, these fuckers here, these cunts are getting more powerful than us now. They're creating art. They're like us. They're thinking about ideas. So Zeus freaks out and he's like, I gotta stop this. So what Zeus does to stop the humans overtaking the gods, he goes to one of the early humans. Her name is Pandora. And he gives Pandora a beautiful box, this lovely jewelry box. And he says to Pandora, don't fucking open it. But the humans are really curious, creative people. And Pandora cannot resist opening this box. She just can't resist it. So one day she does. But when she opens the box, what's released is suffering, jealousy, anger, low self-esteem, anxiety, revenge, rage. Now the humans are basically capped. Zeus was like the programmer of this universe, and he released a virus. So now the humans can't become more powerful than the gods because they have mental health issues effectively. But he left one final little object in Pandora's box, and that was hope. And the thing is if the human world was now so miserable because Zeus had introduced pain and suffering, why did the humans not self-destruct? Because they had hope. And Zeus and Prometheus found this really funny. This was really funny to them. You know what I mean? Mm. And I love that story because obviously it reminds us of right now how we speak about AI. Like this is written down 2,500 years ago, and Zeus and Prometheus are having the exact same argument that scientists are having now about whether or not to create AI. But what I find beautiful is the thing that made humans human was the capacity to make art, and that's what, like, humans are animals. We're animals. We're fucking monkeys. We're wolves. We're whatever. We're just animals. But what does separate us from all other animals is language. You know, we have the capacity to discuss ideas. I don't think even dolphins, as smart as they are, they can communicate, they can play games, but I don't think two dolphins can both speak together about a thing and then to debate about that thing abstractly. That's the uniqueness of humanity. And art comes from that. In order for you and I to create a piece of art, we both have to both look at it and have opinions about it. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So it is a uniquely human thing. I mean, what's the point of art?
Is it a fundamental weakness, I wonder? If that same curiosity that compels her to open the box that creates this, is it the type of sensitivity that is necessary to be able to discuss things on an emotional level, or to create things to decorate your time and your space?
So we spoke about this, Devin, and I like to think I create art because it gives me personal meaning.
Mm-hmm.
It gives me a sense of, when I do create art and I'm happy with that art, I feel like I'm happy to be alive, and I feel like this is the reason I am alive. But you probed me further, and what I realized was, and this is the dark side, sometimes when I create art, I think really what I'm looking for is immortality.
Mm.
It's I'm gonna die someday, and I know this, and I don't fully accept this. But maybe if I leave a story, a book, a piece of music, even when I'm dead, people are gonna listen to it. So therefore, I'm not really dead. Like Kurt Cobain isn't really dead. Tupac isn't really dead. How can they be? And the other thing too is, like, I've there's two Tupacs, and there's two Devin Townsends. There's Devin Townsend, the human being, and then there's the hyper real version of Devin Townsend that's presented through the music. And that Devin Townsend can't really die, but real Devin can.
Oh yeah, man. Can he ever? I
You sound like you've done it before. You can do it multiple times.
Yeah, man, that's my superhero strength. Well, it's interesting because when we're talking about the idea of immortality through art, it makes me wonder two things. One, what society's responsibility to artists is as a result of that being a part of the foundational value of creating art. And the second thing would be how AI plays into that.
Well, the first thing there about the responsibility of society, so it's about how relevant, like, so in ancient Ireland, and when I say ancient, I mean before we were colonized by Britain, so indigenous Irish culture, one of the most powerful members of Irish society was the poet. And the reason the poet was so, when I mean important, I mean if you were a poet in ancient Irish society, 1500 years ago, 1200 years ago, like, you were provided for. You were seen as, the poets were druids effectively. And in Ireland, we had an oral culture. So we did not have writing. So when you have an oral culture, everything has to be preserved through storytelling. You can't write shit down. So the mountains, the landscape, the trees, you have to hold on to knowledge in the most interesting way possible. And the most interesting way possible is the best stories. So artists in ancient Irish society, poets, were deeply, deeply important because they held geography, economics, laws, and maps effectively of the known world, and they held these things in their stories that they couldn't write down, and stories that only they could remember and pass on orally. So these people were very, very important and were protected in society and had quite a lot of power. Now, art has been completely consumed and absorbed by capitalism. So art now, its value in society is how much money can it make? I mean, we've lived through. Like, I always think the 20th century is very, very special, and I think the 20th century will be remembered the way we look at the Renaissance. The reason being, music is the oldest art form. Like, probably the first thing a human ever created was a song of some description, the human voice, and music has been around so long. I'm talking 50, 60,000 years, maybe even longer if we're talking about hominids, maybe Neanderthals sang, we don't know. But music has been around for so long, but only in the 20th century was it able to be recorded. Like, you could paint and paint a picture thousands of years ago, and someone else could see that and learn. But 400 years ago, a piece of music, it just disappeared into the air, and that was it. It was gone forever. And then the 20th century happens, and all of a sudden now you've got recording, and you can listen back to one piece of music over and over again, and look at what that did to creativity and the explosion of creativity. But we've also lived through the internet, devaluing music. So now, Jesus, I feel very sorry for anyone who wants to enter the music industry at the moment. If they need to do it within the system of capitalism where they're relying upon it to earn a living, it's fucking tough right now. Mm-hmm. It's really tough. Whereas, like we spoke about, I don't think an artist like Frank Zappa, we'll say, would be around today. If you think of how weird some of the stuff Frank Zappa was doing in the 70s, he was able to earn a living doing that. I don't think the modern Frank Zappa is able to do that right now. I think they just work in a restaurant and we haven't heard their stuff because maybe I'm being cynical, but that's just how I feel.
That makes sense. And I was going to say as well, I had a discussion with a friend of mine the other day about nature consciousness and whether or not consciousness was just a reaction to conglomeration of cells and your gut biome and all the things that create you, all these billions of elements of your own humanity, and what you take in when it comes to media, what you take in when it comes to fuel or food, creates an environment that consciousness is a byproduct of. Now, this is a certain thought that they had, and I'm not entirely convinced of, well, I'm clearly not clever enough to know. But what that made me think is, okay, so say your entire nature is made up of a sum total of your experiences, what you put into your body, who you are, your diseases, your lack thereof, the art that is produced as a result of these circumstances. How much do we have an actual connection to, or a the idea of the collective unconscious where art mm-hmm. exists external from us, or all human experience sort of amalgamates into these pre-existing melodies and thoughts. I just keep going back to the idea of what's our responsibility then to our creative nature. Do we have any need to try and navigate that or control that, or is it just the surrender to what we are and then just trying to follow that flow where it leads?
I'd say it depends on the individual, Devin. For me, so when I create, I'm always searching for flow. I'm searching for, I don't want to be, I don't know, is conscious the right word? When I create with intensity, it feels like a waking daydream. I'm not fully aware of it. I'm in a state of flow. And the state of flow, it's not conscious. It's not conscious. The state of flow it's skilled, really skilled daydreaming. That's the only way I can describe it. Because it feels awesome. Like a daydream, like when you daydream and it's like, you're staring off into the distance, but you're effectively in another world. Flow for me is daydreaming, except there's skill involved. And afterwards I go, how the fuck did I do that?
Well, question on that then. How does accountability play into that process for you. Do you consider it?
How do you mean accountability there, Devin?
So if you're in a state of flow where the fundamental nature of it requires surrender, and the more conscious you are of that process, the less you're going to be able to excavate what's in that state of flow. If you have any sort of self-deprecating nature or any sense that past actions have led to results that you would not want to repeat, how do you navigate that surrender that needs to be with flow, with not wanting to repeat toxic patterns from the past or say anything that, I guess it's just self-trust on some level?
So I see what you're saying there. So when I tried to compartmentalize flow, I tried to so because I'm a professional artist and writer, like there was a psychologist, his name was Csikszentmihalyi or something like that. It's literally the hardest name in the world to pronounce and to spell, but he's the only psychologist who properly studied the state of flow. And he studied artists, athletes, and tried to figure out what is flow and can it be induced.
Mm.
And what he came about with was, he said the first thing you need is time, space. So you set time. So when I create, I decide I am now setting a time to create. And usually for me, it's like 3 hours. So I sit down at a desk or in a cafe, and for the next 3 hours, I'm going to create something. And the first step is time. And within that first step, the biggest skill is tolerating the frustration of doing something shit. That's really it. I mean, flow is play. That's all flow is. If you see a kid playing with Lego, they're in a state of flow. So me as an adult artist, when I'm writing, I'm trying to achieve a state of play. I want to be playful. And within playfulness, there's no criticality. There's no such thing as right, wrong, good or bad. And once I can get past the critical part of my brain, the part of my brain that wants to create something good or create something bad, once I go past that, then I enter the state of flow. What's very important to get into that state is always humor. You can't be solemn. Solemnity is this weird performance of seriousness. Like if I sit down to write, I can't think of myself as, oh, I'm a writer and I'm going to write something great now. And I can't think about like James Joyce or any of these writers that I look up to. What I'm aiming for is, I'm going to do something silly. I'm going to do something silly. And often I enter flow by thinking of the worst idea I can possibly think of and running with it. I find that really helpful, because also the fear of failure is a barrier too. If you try to create something good, you're setting the bar quite high, and then the fear of failure becomes quite big, and that will stop you entering flow, and that becomes frustrating. So I tolerate that frustration and try to come up with a really shit, terrible idea. Like, I'm just trying to think of one off the top of my head.
It's awesome.
I had an idea, and this turned into a 10,000 short story that I was really happy with, but it's a short story about the actor Gabriel Byrne, who becomes convinced that he can create system restore points for himself by snorting bags of his skin when he was a child. You know what I mean? And that came into my head, that is fucking stupid. That's the most stupid idea I could think of. Let's try and do it for 10,000 words. And when you start off with something that's like, this is silly and this is stupid, then what you're doing there is, failure isn't a factor. You can't fail, you can't succeed, because what you're doing is something silly, you're having fun. And then once you're silly and once you're having fun, you unlock your unique creative voice. And then you're in flow and you go, oh, I just created something good there. But you can't sit down and say, I'm going to create something good today. You have to create something, you have to try and be silly. And then the good art will come from silliness. Or with music, what I often say to people if they're creatively stuck, instead of trying to write a song that's good, think of the music that you genuinely don't like. Think of a band that for whatever reason you hate. Try and write a song like them. You know, try and do that. Aim for the song, for the music that you despise. Try and write a song like them. And then that will unlock something quite good. Like I often think of the Cramps.
Mm-hmm.
So the dude from the Cramps, who I think they invented a genre called psychobilly, but like he started off doing really funny impressions of Elvis. That's what he was doing, impressions of Elvis. And through the freedom and fun and silliness of doing Elvis impressions, ended up inventing a genre, you know? Like I often heard too that I think it was REM. When REM were making songs in their garage when they were like 16, they didn't say like we're gonna write some cool songs today. They would get like Beatles chords and Dylan's lyrics, and they'd try and see what would this sound like. Why don't we sing some Dylan lyrics over a Beatles chords? And whatever it was about the playfulness and silliness of that process, by the end of it, they're writing their own songs. You're tearing down the barrier to failure.
That's amazing. So here's a question in light of that. How do you cultivate in yourself tolerance for your own, for the beginning of this process?
How do I tolerate the frustration? How do I tolerate frustration? So that there is all about self-esteem, Devin, right? And this is quite important. Like, I always look to a psychologist called Carl Rogers for this shit. Carl Rogers says that we have our real self and our ideal self. So chances are, like, I'll just speak for me. When I was a kid, at an early age, it became clear, like I'm talking maybe 4 or 5 years of age, at an early age, it became clear that I was quite talented at drawing and playing music. It was quite clear that I was a creative kid. And when you're a child and you exhibit a talent of some description, usually what happens is that the adults around you will go, oh my God, that's amazing. When I was 4 and I was drawing a pretty good picture of a cat, my brothers, my sisters, my parents went, you are amazing. This is incredible. And I received all this praise. Like I'm just a little child new in the world. But suddenly I'm receiving this praise from the adults around me because I'm good at drawing cats, or I'm good at sitting down with a keyboard and writing a little melody. And what Carl Rogers called that was conditions of worth, conditional positive regard. You receive positive regard from the adults because you've done a thing, some aspect of your behavior. But what can happen is, as your personality develops, this turns into what's called conditional positive self-regard. So the mind tricks itself into thinking, okay, if I do a little painting here, and then my parents say that I'm brilliant because of this, and I get all these smiles and love and hug and attention, then that must mean that I am a good person when I create. And what can happen then with the adult, and this is for a lot of artists, your self-esteem and your self-worth and your identity can become tied in with being good at your art. And that's real fucking dangerous. That's really fucking dangerous. And it's one of the hardest things to battle with any type of creativity. So what it means is, when I sit down to create, to write something, I used to write songs as well, to write songs, whatever the fuck. When I sit down to create, if my sense of self and my sense of identity is tied into being good at art, it means that failure, the price of failure is being a horrible person. Because I've learned as a child, you receive love from the adults when you're good at art. And I've internalized this as, I am only worthy of love. I'm only worthy as a person when I'm a good artist. And of course, that's fucking bullshit. You know, go hang out with your friends who don't give a fuck about art and who love sports. I say to them, oh, I wrote a short story last weekend. They don't give a fuck. They care about sports. And often what I think of when I'm trying to tolerate the frustration of that, when I'm trying to not define my worth by an aspect of my behavior, such as how good I am at art, what I think of is cooking. I didn't grow up in a house where cooking was that important. Food was just something that was there. It was something that you ate. I learned how to cook as an adult when I was like 20 and I was living on my own. And I love cooking, and I'm quite good at cooking, and I'm really passionate about it. But if I make a lasagna and I burn it, I don't self-flagellate afterwards. Like if I burn a lasagna, I just burned a lasagna. It's mildly disappointing, but I don't feel like a failure as a human being afterwards. If I decide to cook a lasagna tomorrow, I'm not scared that if I fuck that lasagna up, I'm a useless piece of shit and any talent I ever had was just a mistake and now I'm going to be found out. It's a simple, and the reason is that I learned how to cook as an adult. My self-esteem and my identity is in no way tied up with my capacity or ability to cook. It's simply disappointing when I fail. But switch that around to art, I can get creative block for 6 fucking months, terrified to sit down and write. Because if I don't write something good, I will feel like a horrible, horrendous person with no worth or value. So it's a consistent battle of managing my mental health so that I don't succumb to that and so that I understand as well. I know I'm good at art. I'm good at creating things, but that doesn't make me a good person. It does not in any way. It just means I'm a person who's good at creating art. And if I create a good story or a bad story, my worth as a human does not change at all. And what I always remind myself is all humans have the exact same worth. We all have intrinsic value. We're no better than any one person. No one is better than me and no one is worse than me, because you can't compare human value. You can't compare two humans' value to one another, you know? No aspect of my behavior defines my worth as a human being, and art is just an aspect of my behavior.
The
I think your little video went there, Devin, but I can still hear you perfectly.
That's even better. I think oh man.
It had some heat warning.
Oh, is that what it is?
It said something man. Too cool. What camera are you using? Is it a webcam or is it a DSLR?
It's a Sony one, but I have to say the fact that it went black is actually kind of relieving.
Okay. Don't like looking at yourself on the screen when I'm not there.
I've never been a huge fan of it, to be perfectly honest. Yeah. But this is actually now we can both be shrouded, man. You were talking about the flow state. Flow is play. You were talking about the 3 stages of it. First, trying to find the time, about 3 hours, trying to cultivate tolerance during that period. Then the space, and forgive me, but I missed the third part.
Do you know why? Because I fucking forgot it, Devin, and I'm trying to find it here on Google.
Yeah, I'm just going to get naked now.
But what I can say is that actually the best online lecture you will find about the stages of creativity was done by John Cleese from Monty Python.
Oh, okay.
John Cleese from Monty Python. He after Monty Python, he became a psychologist for a while, or he studied psychology, and he went looking into this psychologist who studied flow. And John Cleese used to do lectures about creativity and the conditions needed for flow. So I was just trying to find his PowerPoint on Google so I could remember what the stages of flow were.
We could make one up. And in fact, you had said something earlier that I was intrigued about what your answer would be. We had thought perhaps the first sound that a Neanderthal had made was a sound or a song. And I just wonder what that would be like.
Did you ever hear the record? You know they modeled the Neanderthal's lungs and tried to create. Yeah. So what they did was they got a Neanderthal's rib cage and tried to figure out, based on the size of its chest, what would a Neanderthal sound like. So then they recreated exactly a Neanderthal's voice. Sounds like a frightened teenage boy. Sounds like a frightened prepubescent teenage boy. They had quite small lungs.
Yeah. I imagine that would be just the hit of the day too. You know, there was the one guy wandering around that he was the only one that was able to produce that particular sound in such a way that the rest of the Neanderthal population would swoon. Right?
Yes.
It's amazing. You know, it's funny. Here's something that I would like to even bring up, and I get your impression of it. So the video flickered out. Yeah. And it's amazing how all it takes to disrupt a state is something like that. You know,
For the video to go.
yeah, that's all it takes. And I know for myself, it's you've got a certain set of parameters that you set up to put yourself into a flow state. And then the slightest amount of distraction pulls you out of that. And to be pulled out of that,
That's true.
it's such a frustration. And I find that for myself, trying to get back into it is almost, I get petulant about it. I'm like, oh, I don't want to, you know what? It's like, it's almost, it shines a light on the vulnerability of that state, of how you're sort of subconsciously allowing yourself to just sort of participate with this flow of energy that you don't realize at the time has so much to do with all these subtle nuances that create that environment. And then once you're out of it, it's shocking how it's like you've just shaken your head. It's like you've got punched in the mouth and you've had to look around and be like, oh, where was I? What do I do?
That's why time and space are part of the conditions of entering flow. You do genuinely have to create an environment where you have zero distractions.
So when you're improvising, now I was talking to a friend of mine about this the other day. The whole act of improvising requires you to be subtly connected to what's coming out of you while disassociated with it to enough of an extent that you can just participate in it passively. So in a similar way to being disrupted by the camera going out, if you were, say, improvising on an instrument and then you hear yourself play and you're into it, you're like, oh, this is great. We're creating something here. We're creating a moment. And then you hit a wrong note, which can be an analogy for the camera going out. How do you cultivate tolerance for an instance like that?
With music, I genuinely find cannabis to be useful for that exact thing. You keep kind of, it's the discipline to keep going. A distraction, the thing is too with a distraction, and this is what takes practice, we have a choice around how we react to a distraction. Now, if you're really into flow, when a distraction happens, you incorporate that into your process. Like, I'll give you an example. I was recording a podcast once, and when I record my podcasts, I'm in a deep state of flow when I'm in the middle of a podcast, because my podcasts they're monologue essays. And what I say is I write with my mouth for people to read with their ears. And I can be getting into deep flow speaking about a topic in my podcast. And there was one particular podcast where, you know, when your smoke alarm doesn't have a battery, so it makes that beep. So I was trying to record this podcast and I just had that beep noise in the background. And it kept pulling me out of flow. And this is where it comes to the choice about how I react. Instead of saying, fuck this, I can't record the podcast today because of that stupid beeping smoke alarm, I left it in and spoke about it and made it part. I said, today there's a smoke alarm beeping. But then it got too overwhelming. And what happened was, I said, fuck this, I got to stop this smoke alarm. So I paused the podcast and went out to my hallway where the beeping smoke alarm was. But it was up too high, I couldn't reach it. So I got a hurley, which is like an Irish hockey stick, and I hit the smoke alarm off the ceiling. And I did this, and I'm like, fuck it, I'll get another smoke alarm. So I hit the smoke alarm off the ceiling, and the battery fell off, and that was that. It was finished, it was done. I went back to record my podcast, and then during the middle of it, I hear this massive explosion, and I get a fright in the middle of the podcast. And I thought there was a ghost in my house because I was empty. I was like, what the fuck was that bang? So I go out to investigate, and it was the battery. The battery had exploded because I just hit it with a hurley. But here's the thing. I didn't stop recording. What I did is I brought that into the process. And now I'm speaking to my listeners exactly what I'm saying here. That bang that you just heard while I was recording, that bang, which I believed to be a poltergeist, was actually a battery exploding. But then what I did is mid-podcast, I went back to the sound of that explosion and said, let's fucking write a song with this explosion. So I got the bang of that battery exploding and made a simple 4/4 beat out of it, and then wrote a song about a poltergeist. Do you get what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
So a number of things there happened which could have fucking destroyed my flow.
Well, you.
First off,
Oh, sorry, go on.
the smoke alarm, I could have just said, I'm not recording today, fuck this. I didn't. A challenge presented itself, and I improvised with that challenge. I improvised with the smoke alarm, and then I improvised with the exploding battery. So that's what I would say to, and I don't just mean musical improvisation. Whatever the fuck you're doing that's creative, you have a choice about how you react to a distraction. And the real creative thing to do is to bring that distraction into your process. That's the real creative thing to do. Like if you're writing a song and someone walks in with their dick out, don't go, oh my God, there's a man here with his dick out in the studio. What are we going to do? Write a song about his dick. Or play the guitar with his dick. You know what I mean? That's
a fleshy slide.
Yeah. Like over the pandemic, I did this thing when I couldn't gig anymore and I wanted to get back to making music. I went onto Twitch, and basically what I was doing, Devin, was I was playing the video game Red Dead Redemption, okay, live as an audience watched. But I had a looping pedal and a bunch of instruments. So what I did is instead of commenting on this video game as I played it live, I was writing songs live to the events of the video game as people watched. And what I was trying to do there was publicly fail, I suppose.
It's interesting.
I sound insane.
No, you don't. You sound like one of the least insane people that in fact, I was thinking earlier on, having this conversation with you makes me feel so much less, so much less insane, to be honest, because a lot of times, even the desire to analyze creativity or to analyze one's intent can come across as being rooted in some sort of narcissism, when upon thinking about it and really sitting with it, I think it's the only way to progress as a person is to understand what your motivations for what you do are. And if it's coming from a place of narcissism, or if it's coming from a place of ego, then you would be well suited to be able to make that assumption and say, yes, that's actually what its root is. And then from there, you've got a framework objectively to move forward. And it's funny because your description of incorporating distractions into an improvisational flow.
I call it embracing failure. You make the failure part of your process.
I couldn't agree more. But for people who maybe are struggling with self-esteem on a real basic level, where the idea of deconstructing their past and their personality to the point where they can understand how to cultivate self-esteem into their process, it's a huge journey. But discipline.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're saying, okay, the discipline that is required to cultivate a reaction to a distraction that doesn't allow that distraction to disrupt it completely, how would one cultivate that sort of discipline?
Failure.
Accepting it?
Straight up. Failure.
Mm.
You got to fail.
Mm-hmm.
If you want confidence as an artist, you have to fucking fail and fail and fail. You really do. I mean, it's even Samuel Beckett has a quote, which is fail, fail more, fail better. Genuinely, the only way you will develop confidence as an artist is to fail consistently. Like, the metaphor I use to describe this is, if you think of a firefighter's job is to run into a burning building and to put out some flames. So that firefighter cannot be afraid of flames. So what does the firefighter do? Every single fucking day, he jumps into flames. In the firehouse, they train. Like in Limerick, we've got quite a high rate of suicide in Limerick, where I'm from, Limerick City. We have a large river, and quite a lot of people jump into this river. and we have people who rescue people from drowning. And I watch these people train. A lot of these people some of them are firefighters, others are volunteers. And I watch them train in the river. And they jump into the river every day wearing full clothes in the rapids. They do terrifying things. They practice so that when they see a person trying to take their life, that they can comfortably jump in wearing all their clothes and swim against the rapids in order to save that person. And I know it sounds silly to compare the job of an artist to a person who's saving another person's life. I'm not trying to make that comparison, but what I'm saying is, if you're an artist, what will stop you creating is the fear of fucking failing. So fail. Fail publicly, fail massively, all the time as much as possible. And you keep... How do you do it?
No, I was going to say, I'm sorry to interrupt. Go on.
I mean, I don't have anything else to say. I mean, what was your how question there?
How do you deal with the fear of success?
How do I what?
Deal with a fear of success, because fear of failure is an overt fear. Mm-hmm. You can very clearly define that and identify it. But I think much more subversive fear, for me at least, has been fear of actually when things succeed.
So I don't struggle with I wouldn't struggle with a fear of success, but what I do find, so I fail frequently, and because I fail frequently, I succeed frequently as well, because I'm trying all the time. And the thing is with success is it's I'm not frightened of getting success, but when I do have it, and anxiety comes on, and I'm afraid of losing it. That's what I'm afraid of. It's the fear of then losing the success. That's what becomes frightening. And if I'm too afraid of losing that success, that's what informs the next fear of failing.
Mm. Do you find that fear, that the fear of losing it, is there ever the imposter syndrome with you anymore, where you've found success and then you think that you're not worthy of it on some level?
Frequently, yeah. Always. What I often do as well, though, Devin, I question my definition of what success is. So this is where I got to be careful. So my most recent book came out 2 months ago, and that's considered a success by the external factors of how we define success. And what I mean is, the book was a bestseller and it got a bunch of good reviews. So that's kind of externally, that's considered a success. Whereas the book I wrote before that, it sold okay, but it got really terrible reviews. But I loved writing both books. And what I have to be careful of is that I don't want to define success in art as that sold loads and got great reviews. I have to be careful that I don't allow that to be my definition of success. So what I work on as daily practice, my definition of success is, can I earn a living doing what I love? That if I can do that, then I feel successful. And when I say there, earn a living, I don't mean like monetary gain. Earn a living there just means if I'm earning a living from art and I don't have to get a second job, then it means that all my time that I have goes into making art. So that for me, I try and define success that way. And when I find myself getting a bunch of good reviews or selling a lot of books, if I find myself feeling good about that, what I remind myself of is, that's that little child in you. That's the little child whose parents told him that he was good when he did a good painting. And I'm not that child, I'm a grown adult. I can't define my worth that way. Because the next book I could write could get shit reviews and sell nothing. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
I do.
What's important is whether I enjoy the process. I also try to make art about the process as well, Devin. The fun part of art is the making, not necessarily the end result.
I agree 100%. And you've, in listening to you and having participated in your works for as long as I have, I have a question based on your favorite writers, because I'd love to know more about the differences between writing music and then writing a narrative or a story. Who were some of the inspiration or the most influential writers for you? Were they based in Ireland? You said James Joyce.
So, but in terms of, we'll say, what we'd call literature, like the written word on a page, James Joyce, I fucking adore. People say that James Joyce is complicated. He's not. You can read James Joyce as humor if you want. Here's what I adore about James Joyce. He was writing in like about 1915, 1916, and cinema didn't really exist in 1915, 16. Like, it did exist. The medium of cinema existed, but the art form of cinema didn't really exist in 1915, 1916. And James Joyce actually opened the first cinema in Ireland. He actually did that. And what I adore about James Joyce's writing, in particular, he's got a book called Dubliners, which is a collection of short stories. He was imagining what cinema could be before the technology existed. Like, he describes scenes in his writing, which is like a camera on a helicopter type shit, but no one had ever seen that. So I love the vision of James Joyce's writing. And another writer that was hugely influential to me, and you'd love this fella, he was an Irish writer called Flann O'Brien. Flann O'Brien is credited with inventing postmodernism. He was a deeply surreal Irish writer. Flann O'Brien wrote a book about a man turning into a bicycle. You know what I mean? Really funny, deeply funny, and good art for me is anything that makes me want to create and makes me feel free. And Flann O'Brien's work did that for me.
Walter Beckett. Was that the name?
Yeah. Oh, no, Samuel Beckett.
Samuel Beckett, yeah. So what's he all about?
Samuel Beckett was a writer and a playwright, and his shtick was absurdism. And how do you fucking define absurdism in art? Absurdity is the search for meaning when you know that life is meaningless. You know, that's what absurdity is considered. It's the search for meaning when you truly understand that life is meaningless.
Is it a nihilistic form of
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the fruiting body of absurdity is often surrealism, you know? And like Beckett, Beckett had a play from 1953 called Crap's Last Tape. And all it is it's a play. It's one dude on stage, and this dude spent his life sitting down with a tape recorder and recording himself talking into a tape every single day. And in the play, he just listens back to it. And what I adore about this is, in the 1950s, this was considered the utter height of absurdity, the height of absurdity and surrealism. Oh my God, can you imagine a person sitting down recording themselves every day and listening back? That's just a podcast now. What was impossibly absurd in 1950 is now completely normal. And I adore that about Beckett's writing. Beckett also wrote a famous play called Waiting for Godot. He's got another play. It's just two lads in a dustbin arguing about whether to or not to eat a dog biscuit. You know, like I get influences from all over the place. I like to, like, I did a podcast this week about, like, I love Ernest Hemingway. I love painting as well. Like, the podcast I did this week was, I was speaking about the influence that the Eiffel Tower had on art. The Eiffel Tower was built in 1890 in Paris. And in 1890, like, photography existed, but most people didn't have access to photographs. Like, photography was a very recent art form in 1890. The culture was, there was a visual poverty in culture. You didn't have glossy magazines, you didn't have television. So in 1890, people didn't really know, people who lived in Paris their whole lives didn't really know what a bird's eye view of Paris looked like. And then when they built the Eiffel Tower, for the first time, everyday people were able to climb a couple of 100 feet in the air and see the city from a completely different angle. They were able to see a new perspective of the city. And this really changed art. This changed how people painted and thought about seeing. And from this, you got a painter called Paul Cézanne. And what Paul Cézanne did, because he'd seen Paris from the Eiffel Tower, is he was like, I'm not going to paint what I see anymore. I'm going to paint paintings that are about how we see.
Mm-hmm.
So he fucked with perspective. He fucked with depth. He'd paint a landscape and it would appear that the sky was closer than the tree. He really fucked with everything. But then Ernest Hemingway, the American writer, he saw Cézanne's paintings in a gallery in the 1920s. And this then changed how Ernest Hemingway thought about writing. So Hemingway then was thinking, well, if this painter is removing perspective, what if I take away plot? What if I write stories that don't appear to have plot or don't appear to have purpose? And instead what I focus on is loads of small little details. And then the purpose and the plot happens not on the page, but in the mind of the person reading it. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So things like that influence me. Like I think about art consistently. I mean, music, I adore Scott Walker.
Yeah,
Canadian.
You
I tried
introduced
to get
him.
you into fucking Scott Walker.
And I
didn't
have since. It's like I ended up mowing the lawn to his music for a whole summer. And
Fuck off, did you?
I did. And the melodies.
The early stuff or the later stuff?
Well, there was both, actually. Both. And it was, what was really interesting about his work is it stuck with me and colored my world in a way that I didn't expect. It's
fantastic. I'm so glad I turned you on to him. See, I love doing that as well, Devin. That, like, telling another person who loves art and showing them a piece of art that they love, I fucking adore that.
He's a hard sell to others, though, I have to say. There's a couple of people that I played. I think it was Bish Bosh, one of their the first song with that percussive thing, and it really bothered this one person to the point where not only did it bother them, but it stuck with them. Like it just stained the fabric of their being for a couple of days. And I think that after watching, there was a documentary they made on him.
30th Century Man, yeah.
Yeah, and David Bowie apparently was
He produced it, yeah.
And it was just, you see where he was coming from. And I found the nature of his work to be so inspiring, but also tormented in a way that I found was infectious.
Mm-hmm.
It was like, if I wasn't careful, after a few days of just listening to the music over and over again, it haunted my world in a way that was amazing. It was amazing. Just the ability to do that as an artist it's the first time I've encountered something that had that specific effect.
What I adore about your friend's reaction to Scott Walker's music too is that gets us to ask questions about what art is. Like, for me, art is about impacting and affecting people. And your body was impacted and affected deeply, even though it was negative. Like, a bad reaction, what you want out of art, you want one half of the audience cheering and the other half throwing bottles at you. But what you never want is the audience with their backs to you because they're buying drinks at the bar.
Mm.
You know what I mean?
I do.
And a visceral reaction, whether it's joy or hate, something that makes me feel something. Like, there's so many albums, especially back in the days of CDs, when I'm buying a CD and it's €25 to buy it. So I got to stick with this fucking CD because it cost me 25 quid. And there were times where I would buy something and I fucking hate it. I hate it so much, but I stuck with it until I liked it. And often when I hear a piece of new music and I hate it, right, I have the reaction of turn it off. It means I'm not ready to like it yet. But if I hear music and I just forget it, then I genuinely don't like it.
Mm.
So, I mean, Jesus, if there's a lot of people, if I played them your stuff, they would have that reaction that your buddy had to Scott Walker. They'd be like, this is too loud. This is insane. And I'm like, yeah, isn't it lovely? This is what I like about it.
Well, it's interesting because goes back to what I was alluding to with the idea of accountability. I think that uh, in light of how we analyze our motivations or our intent, I think it's alluring to try to create things simply to be provocative. And by doing that,
Mm-hmm.
I have found just through practical experience that if I'm not aware that that's a foundational part of my process during that period, and I'm not willing to accept it as such, then it draws into my world things that I'm not prepared for because I'm doing it for a reason that I don't understand.
Okay, I understand. Yeah.
And so I think, you're talking about these writers, and in the beginning of our conversation we were talking about what the foundational um, value for the species is of art. So how does narrative and stories, how does that play into communication with people? Because through stories that have analogy or through stories that remove plot or remove perspective, there's a conscious decision or an intent to try to uh, create a reaction or to create an emotional experience. How have stories and narrative evolved to help, I guess, the species? Have they, in your opinion?
So, like, art can help you process emotions that you mightn't have words for.
Oh, cool.
Um, I mean, that's what I love about heavy metal.
That's cool. That's a great thought.
Yeah, because there's so much. Like, there was an interesting psychological study recently, and I mean recently, like in the past 2 months, where they found that, like, a lot of us don't remember what it was like to be 2 years of age. And what the psychologist found recently is that our memories tend to be very much tied in with when we started to speak. So what we remember is what we can form using language.
Ah,
But often we can't understand emotions. Like, I spoke to a dude, he's a psychologist in Australia. Dr. Paul Liknitsky is his name. And he was given the license by the Australian government to study the use of psychedelics and MDMA in a clinical setting. And what he found was when he was dealing with people who had trauma, especially what he described as pre-verbal trauma. So that means he's speaking to people and they have deep trauma, but this trauma occurred at a time before they had fucking words because they were too young.
mm,
He found that MDMA and psychedelics can help whatever it does, visually or emotionally, however it like psychedelics, they can make you see sound, it really mixes with our perception of the world around us. But he found that it was useful with helping people with pre-verbal trauma. And I think that's what art can do sometimes. That's what storytelling can do. We can connect with an emotion that we're trying to understand. Like, Jesus Christ, if you ever get your heart broken, you want to listen to love songs. And it's not just the words, it can be a particular sadness in the chord progression. And whatever it is about it, it soothes you. And people who want to process anger, no, not necessarily. There's an excitement to heavy metal music that I enjoy. Like, I don't know what it is that has me listening to heavy metal sometimes, but it's something emotional. I can process something through that. I often think of, like, when Black Sabbath. This is a little detour. So I have a theory about Black Sabbath, right? So when Black Sabbath first started gigging in America in like 1971, they found that a huge amount of their audience were men who had just come back from Vietnam. So Ozzy's there up on stage playing his early metal, and he's like, why the fuck are there so many vets in the audience? Why are there dudes in wheelchairs and their friends are holding them up? And it wasn't just the song War Pigs. There was something about their music that was helping Vietnam vets process trauma in some way. And what I find particularly interesting about Black Sabbath is they were born in Birmingham in the 1940s. So Black Sabbath as kids grew up around war trauma. They didn't grow up while Birmingham was being bombed by the Nazis, but they grew up in an environment where there was unexploded bombs. So when Ozzy Osbourne was a kid or Tony Iommi was a kid, there were bomb sirens because the local church had a bomb that hadn't exploded. So they grew up around the noise and chaos of war trauma. But then they get to 20 years of age, start making metal, and all of a sudden these Vietnam vets are showing up. And I can't help but draw a connection between those two things, something that isn't verbal, that has to do with the feeling and sound and environment. You know what I mean?
I do. You've been so generous with your time. I don't want to keep you longer. I know it's late there. I was just going to add one thing to your thought on heavy metal.
Yeah.
Because I've spent some time thinking about what is the appeal and why it tends to draw people who are quite sensitive. And from an outsider's point of view, that would seem counterintuitive. Like this is a very aggressive or visceral type of art. Why would a lot of the people be involved with this be as sensitive as they are? And I've often wondered if the sensitivity, the hypersensitivity of people leads you to interpret your environment in a very overt way. Or an exceptionally subtle way. And if everything that's coming into your field of view is too much, and you are also drawn to represent your environment, it stands to reason that the output from people who perceive their environment like that would be extremely intense. And so I often have found that the people in my life who are potentially the least sensitive to their environment are often not the ones playing heavy metal. I mean, you're going to have exceptions to everything, but a lot of the people that I know that play the most extreme music are actually very introverted or very sensitive or interpret their environment in a very direct way. And perhaps there's something to that. But brother, I have to say,
I've thought about it. Here's a question I'd love to ask you, Devin, before we finish.
Sure.
If we take it back to, we'd say, strapping young lad, that sounds like quite, it sounds angry. Now, I love it. What was anger present in you when you were making that?
Yes, but it's funny because the explanations to why I chose to no longer participate in the creation of that fell on deaf ears to people who don't relate to what I'm about to say. So I understand if that still is the case. When I was young, the world that I came into had a lot to do with trying to be protected from anger.
Mm-hmm.
So if your parents, or in my case, my family, was coming out of a scenario where maybe there was a certain degree of trauma that was linked to alcohol or linked to violence, in a young parent's toolkit, because my parents were very young when they had children, and as was the case in that point, overt displays of anger reminded them of trauma. So they went out of their way to protect us from doing so. And as a result of that, any overt displays of anger were reacted to with what I perceived as a child as irrational amounts of anger. And so from a very young age,
anger was punished.
Yeah, and to be feared. And I think that when I started to have experiences, I moved away and moved to Los Angeles when I was 19, and I was naive, and I had a wonderful childhood, really. But I was naive in what these emotions, what their function was within myself, within the species. And it took me years to recognize that, well, anger, and as you say, your reaction to it it's a part of being human. And there's healthy anger and there's unhealthy anger. But when I started to feel anger within myself and I started to experience it with people around me, I didn't know how to deal with it. And what I did find, as I think a lot of people find, is when you have no control over your surroundings or the people around you, the ways that you do find control, everything begins to get hardwired to it. And I found that if I was angrier than others, then it's like people would never have to confront. Like I didn't have to deal with confrontation, because I think in the toolkit that came
You can
from,
wear anger like an armor, like a frightening mask.
Absolutely. But this is why I keep going back to accountability. What I found, and what the biggest lesson for me of participating in that, was you can be angrier than everybody. You can surround yourself with people. You can cover your own emotional sensitivity with a certain type of anger that, people don't want to get near. But what it does is it draws it to you. And that's what it did. It drew it to me. Your vibe attracts your tribe, in a sense. And when I finally was able to psychologically start to unravel what was going on with my emotional growth and my emotional health, and how I needed to proceed if we were going to have children, if we were going to try and move forward in a life as an adult, I started recognizing those patterns. And at that point, I was like, oh, wow, I'm surrounded by this, which I don't fundamentally understand. And then I started seeing the whole work as like a pantomime, in a sense. It was like a parody. And I was electing to be a representative of something that I truly didn't understand. And when I started to put all the pieces together and say, okay, you do understand now what the function of anger is. You do understand that anger is not something to be feared. Anger is a natural part of the species. It's a defense. It's something we've evolved to be able to, protect ourselves from predators. And but if you react to it with fear, if you react to your own anger with fear, or if you react to the anger of others from the perspective of, if they're angry, clearly this is something that I've done. This is me.
Yes.
This is my fault. Then you never...
When you take ownership of their anger.
It. Exactly. And that's what it became to me. And then once I turned that corner in my personal life, when I was able to identify that much of my incentive to write that way was coming from something that I'm like, oh, you're afraid. You're afraid of other people being angry. You're afraid of your own anger. You don't understand it. And then to start to quantify that makes the whole thing, it doesn't negate the quality of what it was, but it casts a light on the intent. And at that point, to try and replicate or to continue doing those things with any degree of authenticity is absurd. It just becomes, and so that's where it was.
Wow. So as you grew as a person, this is no longer authentic to who I am now, so now the art has to change.
Yeah, and the thing that I try to be as consistent with my explanation of as possible is that doesn't negate the authenticity of it at the time. And when I listen to it now, I'm very proud of it, because with the toolkit that I had, my goals haven't changed now as they did then. But that process was essential for me to be able to quantify it and then move forward. And and when you introduced me to Scott Walker, I think one of the reasons why I was so fascinated by him is his trajectory could have been successful in the ways of many of those 60s sort of teen heartthrob pop stars, because I guess in a sense that's how he started. But he chose to remain true to the ways in which his personal development pointed him to go, and to the behest, I'm sure, of a bunch of
people were very disappointed.
Very disappointed, yeah. But I respect that, and I think that there's a real difference between commerce and art in that sense. So, yeah, man.
Thank you so much for that, Devin.
You too.
So what you got to do there now in Zencaster,
okay,
is you got to press stop record.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the important bit.
Okay.
So if you press stop record there, now what's happening on your screen now that you've stopped recording?
Oh, I'm still recording. Here we go. Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Through this year of not touring, I would like to thank Inside Out Music for supporting my dumbass while I write all my new music. So this here is called the Inside Out Minute, where we hear from a member of a band who's on their label. This month, it's Anthony, who plays in the band O. Anthony, Dev, this is Anthony from the band O, and we worked together on the last record. What is your last name, by the way?
Vanacore.
So, here's the
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome, brother. Here's the long and the short of this one. Okay, so we got your name, Anthony Vanacore. Where were you born? Where are you living now?
Okay, I was born in Brooklyn, New York, but basically lived there until I was 4. I grew up in New Jersey, North Jersey, New York City area, and I'm currently living in Beijing, China. Been in China now for 12 years.
So the band, other than yourself, are all they're all Chinese, correct?
Yep, they're all Chinese except myself.
So who are the other members in the band?
Okay, so the vocalist is Lin Wu, and the guitarist is Jing Zhang, and the bass player is Chris Sui.
So you did you go to school for music in America, or?
Yeah, I kind of went pretty much a kind of traditional route. I did undergrad, but I was actually classical, but it was interesting because I got exposed to a lot of things that I probably wouldn't have got exposed to otherwise. Compositionally, especially, I kind of really got interested in composition and counterpoint and all these things. For graduate school, I was actually a jazz major, so I kind of went 2 very different paths. But my roots are in heavy metal. I grew up fucking thrash and Slayer and Metallica. You name it. So I'm kind of a special case. I'm a weird kind of case.
That's probably why we ended up working together, man.
Yeah, probably.
So how did the band start, and how many albums do you have?
Currently, this is our 2nd album, and the band started based on just a few compositions that were written, and Chris and Jing are close buddies of mine here, and I just had them lay down some tracks. This was quite a few years before COVID, a little before COVID. And then there was melodies written over the music, but just in MIDI form, like a piano sound. And a friend of mine introduced Lynn to us. We got really lucky. She was the first singer to come in, and she just blew my mind to pieces when she was laying down the vocal melodies. I never imagined what was going to ensue that day. And based on how those songs went, we decided to make an album out of it because we thought it was too special to just make a demo out of. So we made an album, and that's how the first album came out. And then somehow we got signed to Inside Out Music. And then we met you, and then now there's the 2nd album.
So you play the drums, obviously, but you and Lynn do a lot of the vocal compositions, or is that you?
The vocal melodies, I pretty much write everything. Actually, one track on the new album, Lynn came in one day and improvised over the entire track, the song Redemption. And basically what I did was every single melody in that was one of her improvisations, and I just rearranged it. I just moved the melodies around, but every single melody was actually hers. The rest of the songs I pretty much more or less composed, yeah. But lyrically, she does all the lyrics.
So what's the intent of the music? Do you guys have a theme, or is there any sort of overarching aesthetic that you sort of stick to between these records so far and in the future?
That's a good question, and I'm not sure I really have the answer to it. And without trying to sound like pretentious or whatever, like I kind of like the idea that the music is a little bit of a mystery to even myself, and I almost kind of want to keep it that way. People ask me like, what is this? And I'm like, well, I don't fucking know what it is, and I'm not sure I want to know what it is. Obviously I have a ton of influences in my brain and heart, including you, and I think I kind of just let it come out and just try to write this stuff as organically as possible. But I try not to be restrained by any preconceptions or genres. Obviously there's a lot of metal influence in there, but that's just the fact. That's just a byproduct of what was trying to be expressed. So, but yeah, I guess mystery, enigmatic kind of vibe. I don't know.
No, it's cool, man. When I first heard this stuff, I remember thinking it was really refreshing because most of the things that I hear now, I've heard before, and I'm sure it's the same with you and with most of us. And I remember when Inside Out sent me was it Fortress? I guess was a song from your first record. I forget which the video was. Or starts with an F. Forest.
Farewell, maybe.
One
Farewell.
of them.
There's also Mountain.
Mountain. I think that's
Mountain?
what it was. Maybe it was Mountain.
Maybe
yeah,
Mountain.
it was. Yeah, and I remember thinking, "Oh, that's really cool." And then when the opportunity came up to work together, I thought it'd be interesting to see if we could get your vision put forward in a way that was accurate, as opposed to being constrained to a more commercial preconception. And I think it's really cool. And I think when people get a chance to hear the record, I think it's really good, man. And I support you, and I wish you luck with this, brother.
Thank you so much, man. I mean, we can't thank you enough. I mean, what you just said, it's even more than that. You took what was already, I think, a cool idea and just blew it up, and now it's like something it's beyond our imagination, what we had initially imagined. It's above and beyond that, and that's a lot in part to your contribution. So, man, thank you. Really.
You're welcome, man. We came into each other's life at an opportune moment because I had more than 10 minutes of time, and now I've got less than 10 minutes for the rest of the year, and that's kind of the way I like it. So I'm glad to have helped, and good luck with it. And if anybody's got an opportunity to check out the new O record, what's it called? Frailty?
Yeah, the album title is called Frailty 2, like Roman numerals 2, because it's the second album, and then Frailty, right?
Good luck, Anthony. It was great working with you, buddy. I'll see you.
Thanks,
see you sometime.
Man. Good luck to you too. Talk soon.
Okay. Don't hang up, please.
The tools that make this podcast possible, provided by Roswell Microphones and X5.